Thank you so much for your kind intro. It's really a privilege for me to be here at the Children Advocacy Center with people who day in and day out are dedicated to the welfare, the well-being, the security, the safety, the protection, and the destiny of our most precious asset in the civilization, which are our dear children. The group of people I am addressing, you are in the unique position of seeing people in their most vulnerable spaces. Many people meet people all day, but not in such a vulnerable setting. When people interact in their jobs or in school or wherever they are, work in their workplace, they're always there dressed up, so to speak, in the appropriate uniform, physical uniform and psychological uniform. But when they're sitting with their therapists, with those people who they entrust with their most personal and confidential information, I don't have to describe it to you here. The barriers, the regular social barriers are normally eliminated, which is, of course, the function of good therapy, to be able to help people truly reveal everything that is going on in them, in the famous title, the good and the bad and the ugly. And you are the ones who are the facilitators of it and the recipients of it. And in that case, I think each and every one of us who are connected to this type of work have to realize the critical responsibility of our responses, even our gestures, our relationships, the way we communicate both with the people we're seeing and with their loved ones, with the families and so forth. What's my connection? I'm not a therapist. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a coach. I'm not a psychiatrist. I am some people call me a rabbi. But that's just my own identity crisis that I'm not going to address at this moment. Maybe I'll sit with one of you on the couch in a private setting. I, like many people growing up, did not know much about the plague of child abuse and child molestation. Since I wasn't that good looking and I was fat, so I guess whatever the case was, I was spared. But as I became older and people started to come to me and share with me their stories, a world opened up to me, a very dark world, an ugly world, a world of profound pain and trauma and suffering. First I thought, as we say in Yiddish, maybe I'm just talking to 2 or 3 people who fell off the planet somehow, because this was not spoken about. It wasn't part of the conversation. It was all so pushed under the rug. They said people liked Hollywood kitchens and wall-to-wall carpets, so they could put everything under the carpet. And everything was under the carpet, everything was under the rug. But as I was hearing more and more stories of youngsters who were not youngsters anymore, they were trying to lead functional and functional lives and get married and so forth, and to discover how plagued they were, how devastated they were, how traumatized they were, decades later or years later, I suddenly realized, personally, from my interactions with people, that we have a massive travesty here before us, and it's barely being addressed. And many who were addressing it, not many, those few who were addressing it at the time were usually silenced. When I began talking about this quite elaborately and extensively in different forms, I can't tell you the amount of emails or personal responses that I received that were nothing less than alarming, and some of them grotesque and absolutely vile. And often it was actually people with good intentions, not with evil intentions. People who were as ignorant as I was just a few years earlier. They simply did not know, or they did not want to know. whether it was a conscious decision or sometimes an unconscious decision. And I need not explain to this audience that unconscious decisions run far deeper than conscious decision, because we're not even aware of the motif behind those decisions. So perhaps they were unconscious decisions. I don't want to know. Sometimes I don't know, and sometimes I don't want to know. In Yiddish there's an expression, "Man macht sich nicht wissendig." There's a special confession we say on Yom Kippur, "Al chet shechatanu lefanecha b'yodim or b'lo yodim," which means, as one person once translated it, for the sin that we have sinned before you by things we know, but we make believe that we don't know. And that making believe that we don't know is not always a decision with ill intent and maliciousness. Not necessarily, sometimes, but very often it's not the case. There are all types of rationalizations and justifications. It can't be, it shouldn't be, it's an exception, it's going to work out, who can acknowledge such stuff? But as a result of that, the facts remained. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I think we could say thousands and thousands of innocent young girls and young boys. Their lives, their souls were snuffed out of them. They were murdered, if not physically, emotionally. Not to say that recovery is not there for them. Recovery is always an option. The power of the soul is more powerful than all abuse and molestation. But the pain and the adversity that they have to face is incredibly profound. I want to make a point to some of you, and many of you, who received a good Jewish education, which includes the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and make an interesting point that people don't realize, and that is, when anybody reads through the Bible, the Torah, there are 613 mitzvahs, 613 commandments. I'm translating everything so that everybody in the crowd should be able to understand, no matter your background. I don't mean this as disrespect to those of you who are fluent in biblical Hebrew. And this 613 set of mitzvahs I call the 613 step program for Jewish recovery. Somehow there's a 12-step program and Jews have a 613 step program. That's only because we are a very complicated people. Those who understand Jews, you deal with Jewish patients, you deal with yourself. It's even harder than your patients probably. You deal with your mothers-in-law, you deal with your spouses, you deal with your kids, you deal with your parents, you deal with your communities. Jews are a complicated people. That's the fact. There are three types of Jews. There are neurotics and psychotics and therapists. The difference is the neurotics build castles in the air, and the psychotics live in those castles in the air, and the therapists collect the rent from both of them. And the rent is so often steep, especially if you manage to become a psychiatrist. The other day I said that in a Jewish restaurant, the waiter goes from table to table and asks one question: is anything all right? So sometimes, I just got it. So sometimes when you're complicated, when there's complexity, and there's a long history that is very glorious. Jewish history is glorious, but it's also full of blood and pain. A lot of trauma that's left over for many generations. Trauma travels with the genes. And we have to realize our people have been through a lot. Every people has been through a lot, but Jewish history is very loaded. It's loaded with glory, it's loaded with resolve, with courage, with tremendous faith and wisdom and destiny. And it's also loaded with a lot of persecution and trauma, especially in the last generation with the Holocaust. And the aftermath of that has been very, very evident in the Jewish community on many levels of how we deal with pain, how we deal with outsiders of our community. And therefore, this is not a time to be judgmental. Judgmentalism doesn't help anybody. Our focus always has to be healing, transformation, rebirth, renewal, faith in the human spirit, and most importantly in the divine core of the human spirit. So in the program that Judaism provides for the Jew, the 613-step program of recovery, the Torah, the Bible, usually does not quantify or qualify its mitzvot, its rituals and commandments to compare them to others. It says, for example, if a poor person needs charity, if somebody is destitute, you have a mitzvah, there's a Jewish mitzvah commandment to give what we call tzedakah, charity. The Talmud will come and tell you that charity is equivalent to all other religious precepts, and charity hastens redemption, and shkula tzedakah keneged. The Talmud will equate and give value to the mitzvah by comparing it to various virtues. The Torah prohibits gossip. It's not something that people always embrace, but the Bible in Leviticus prohibits gossip and slander. It's one of our prohibitions. The Talmud will come and equate it with murder, sometimes when you gossip about a person and you destroy their lives, etc. Any mitzvah, whether it's celebrating the Sabbath, or wrapping tefillin, or eating kosher, or fasting on, not eating on Yom Kippur, or shaking a willow and a myrtle twig and a citrus and a frond of a palm tree on Sukkot, or blowing a ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah. The Torah gives these mitzvahs, these commandments, sometimes reasons, and very often no reasons, and the Talmud or the Midrash will discuss reasons. As far as my knowledge in the Bible, there's one exception. There is one scenario where the Torah says, I want to make a comparison. And as far as I know, there's not one other situation where the Torah says, let me explain this to you by comparing it to another situation. It does not do that. It leaves it for your imagination, it leaves it for the rabbis, for the sages, for the commentators, for the mystics throughout history to explain, to qualify, to identify, to compare. One exception, and that is rape. In the case of Deuteronomy, in the portion of Kiseitse, the last book of the 5 books of Moses, Torah is discussing a betrothed woman who was abducted, or not even abducted, but was violated by a man. She is helpless. She is outside of the community. It's not in public, as the Torah says, it's in the field, and there's nobody there. The Torah says, Lanara loy sasa davar. Never ever penalize her. Don't do anything to her, even though she was a married woman and engaged in this relationship. And the reason is, the Torah could have said, because he violated her, because he raped her, it's not her fault, it's his fault. He has to be penalized, not her. But here, the Torah, the Bible, goes out of its way and decides to explain and give perspective. Very, very rare, almost never in the entire Hebrew Bible. And what's the perspective? I'm going to quote it in the original Hebrew and then translate. The Torah says, you know why this lady, this girl, this young woman, or older woman, no difference, is innocent? Ki kasher yakum ish al re'eyu uritzachoy nefesh, kein hadavar hazeh. If you want to understand what just happened, think of it as a man who stood up on his friend and murdered him. That's exactly what happened. So look at this woman as a murdered victim. You're going to penalize her? He has to be penalized, not her. The Torah could have just said, it's not her fault, she was raped. The Torah says, no. I want you to understand that what happened here was murder. Why the need for this comparison? May I suggest it wasn't only for that time, it's also for 3,300 years later. When people reflect, what is our role when we hear news, when we hear a report, when we're given information about rape, molestation, abuse, physical, sexual, mental, emotional, verbal, going on in a family. A brother violating a brother violating a sister, or conversely, an uncle, an aunt, a babysitter, a father, a mother, a grandfather, a grandmother. We don't have to get in here to all of the graphic stories. You heard about it, you'll hear about it. More, we should not hear about it as much as we do. Or a rabbi, a teacher, a counselor, a coach, a friend, a stranger, a relative, whatever the situation is. Sadly, so many of us for so many years must confess the truth. We were not aware of the fact that this is akin to emotional murder, even though it's a verse in our Bible that we cherish, we learn, we teach our children. It's the curriculum of every Jewish school that gives a basic Jewish education. But we never put the two and two together. Now imagine there was somebody going from school to school, from synagogue to synagogue, with a gun. And once a week, they took out one child. It's just 52 children a year. Statistically, it's not that bad. 52 children a year. Would anybody sit down and have to come to the Brooklyn Advocacy Center for Children or any other meeting or conversation or convention anywhere in the world and say, you think we have to tell anybody about this? If the guy is with a gun, yeah, but he has children and he has a wife and the kids have to get married and he has grandchildren and he has a good reputation in the community. Hey, he's murdering kids. Yeah, but you have to be sensitive and you have to think about it and you have to reflect on it and and it's not his kid's fault. And what do you want from his wife? Why are you sentencing her? These are good questions. It's not his wife's fault, and it's not his children's fault. And our heart must go out for them and do whatever we can to help them. But if somebody is holding a gun or a knife and is stabbing children and murdering children, for anybody to entertain the idea that we could just go on and ignore it and repress it and make a meeting and then think about it for 6 months and then give him a warning and then have another school hire him in 2 years because nobody really knew about it, and then have another synagogue hire him, and then have another camp hire him or her. It's ludicrous. It's absurd. And people who otherwise are morally sensitive, and in other areas they will rise and stand up for justice, here suddenly some strange satanic, what's the word I'm looking for, some strange satanic notion has overwhelmed many of us to feel that silence is justified here. But the Torah says silence is directly assisting the crime, because bad things don't happen only when bad people do them. They happen most importantly because good people choose silence. But when one sees that child after child after child has been manipulated in such a profound way, and very often when they came home and they tried telling mommy or tati, their response was equally horrific. Either they didn't believe their children, or they just pushed it under the rug, or they said, don't make a big thing out of nothing. And here the abuse happened a second time. All over again, but even worse, because it's your own father, it's your own mother. It's not anymore the stranger who abused you in the shul, or in the camp, or in your home, or in the basement, or somewhere else. Now it's your own parents who are not being sensitive. And again, they probably also mean well. They want their daughter to get her life together. They want their son to get their life together. Some of these parents are wonderful people. They just don't understand what their child went through. They don't understand the impact. They don't understand the aftermath. They don't understand the emotional consequences. They don't understand the dysfunctionality that sets into the human psyche once you have been abused in such a vulnerable fashion. How maybe 25 years later, when you're trying to have a happy marriage, happy married life with intimacy, you often remain paralyzed, stuck, helpless, full of fear and panic. And you look at yourself, most importantly, as the ultimate loser, as the ultimate shmata. I don't know how to translate shmata. As the ultimate rag, doormat, as the ultimate nobody, as the ultimate nothing. That's why awareness is so important. Education is so important. That's why the Torah compares it to murder. It wants to open our eyes. A lady, talking there about a married lady, but the idea of rape is the same. She was violated in her intimate life. It's not only her marriage that was betrayed, that too. But there was an act here of very, very deep abuse that touches the core of a person's soul, of a person's self-esteem, of a person's identity. God, I believe, has placed all of you in a position where you can help create a new dawn, a brighter tomorrow, a brighter future. And that's always our focus. Our focus is never revenge or vengeance or judgmentalism. Our focus is not even exploring how stupid people are, even though that's important. But that never should be one's focus, because our focus must always be productive, productivity, create light, create hope, create promise, create opportunity. Thank God, with the efforts of a few individuals, especially over the last few years, we have turned a page. We have opened up a new chapter. Today, most people who are sane, normal, and sensitive don't view the issue of child molestation or abuse the way I and so many viewed it just a few years ago. Many of us simply out of ignorance. At an event not long ago, a few years ago, in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, I spoke to an audience of maybe 600 or 700 people. I knew that many of them were victims. Not all of them, many of them were victims. And I stood up publicly and I apologized. I opened up my space. I want to apologize to you. And the reason I want to apologize to you, because I and my colleagues, simply out of ignorance, were unaware of what was often happening in our midst. And we didn't sound the alarm. Some of us intentional, some of us, many of us completely unintentional. And even those who were in positions where they often heard stories, I need not tell you how meek and inadequate the response often was, simply telling the person, get a new job, go to another school, move to another town, just leave for a few weeks. I don't necessarily have to attribute to them vile, malicious behavior, but I must attribute to them profound ignorance and ineptness and an inability to understand, number one, the nature of the molester, and number two, the suffering of the victim. Both things require an enormous education. In the words of the Torah, you're dealing with a murderer and somebody who was murdered. Thank God, not murdered physically, so that there is hope for recovery, for renewal, for transformation. And that must always exist. Friends, when I think about this meeting, I remember another scene. You'll forgive me for referencing that space, that text in which I was educated. That's my bread and butter, as it is for many of you. There was another haunting scene, not in Deuteronomy, but in Genesis. There was a 17-year-old boy, charming, good-looking kid. His name was Joseph. He was loathed by his brothers. They abducted him. They threw him into a pit, first removing the special tunic that his father Jacob purchased for him. Girls, you remember this from Beis Yaakov? Okay. I don't mean to bring back nightmares of school and your gemers and your tests, but you remember this story. They throw him into the pit, and then they take him out of the pit only to sell him into slavery. He becomes a slave. Successful slave, but he lost his freedom. From a prince, he became a slave, and then his master's wife accuses him of trying to rape her. He's innocent. He didn't. On the contrary, he told her it was wrong. But frustrated with his unwillingness to go along with her, she accuses him of violating her. Her husband has to believe her, and he throws him into prison for 12 years. He is now a prisoner in some cave, in some pit, in the Egyptian prison system. And then, in a unique and extraordinary turn of events, he's known as a dream interpreter, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh's blown away by him, and he becomes the prime minister of Egypt. He saves the country from famine, the entire Middle East from famine. And his brothers, 2 decades later, come to Egypt because they need food. And they meet the prime minister, and he recognizes them, and they don't recognize him. And what happens is he accuses them of espionage. He accuses 10 of his brothers, those who sold him into slavery, of being spies. He incarcerates them for 3 days. And then he overhears a conversation between the brothers. This is 21 years after they sold him into slavery. And the brothers turn to each other and they say these words, quoting Genesis, Avol Ashemim Anachnu. We are guilty. We are guilty. We're not spies, but we're guilty. We are not innocent people. Why? You know what, I want to quote this for you. Let me see if I can get this. Aval Hashemim anachnu. Alochinu. We had a brother. Asher ra'inu tzoras nafshoi b'yischanenu yeleinu v'lo shamanu. Al kain ba aleinu atzara hazais. We have seen his distress when he pleaded with us, but we did not listen. That's why we are now suffering and being accused of espionage. Suddenly, when they're thrown into prison, they start making a personal account where they are. And they remember 21 years earlier they had a brother. And he was pleading with them. We can imagine they're taking him and throwing him into a pit. He's begging them for compassion. But we didn't listen. We were deaf to his cries. That's why we are now suffering. That's why we are now experiencing this result, because of what happened, our deafness, our numbness, our cruelty that we displayed to our brothers. And by the way, just interestingly, those who are familiar with the Torah know, when the Torah tells the story the first time, we never knew that Joseph begged his brothers for mercy. It's not part of the story. We only learn about this 20 years later. He was begging for mercy. Why doesn't it say it the first time? Maybe the Torah doesn't say all the details. That's what Nachmanides writes, Ramban writes. Or maybe it was a different type of cry. Maybe it was begging with the eyes. Maybe not with the mouth. Sometimes you look at your patients. You look into a child's eyes. You look into a teenager's eyes. You look into a young adult's eyes. And you could see. They may not be able to say it to you. I need not explain to you the courage it takes for some people to say those words. This is what happened to me. I knew a youngster who would come to me constantly for guidance and help. Brilliant kid, wonderful person, good looking, charming, clever, deep, wise, spirited, really just a good kid. But his life was always deteriorating. He was always expelled from school, always getting into trouble, and at one point he ended up in prison. At the age of 30, he came to speak to me one night, just about his challenges and problems. We spoke for an hour or two. 1 o'clock in the morning, I said goodbye to him. And I was living in an apartment building in Brooklyn on New York Avenue. And I escorted him out, and at the steps going down to the front door, I turned to him and I said, I have now known you for 17 years. Your life has been one never-ending series of one problem after another problem. There is something that's inside of you. There's a worm eating up at you. What is it? What is it? Because you get it, but you still don't get it. You get it, but you don't get it. And I'll never remember, he was by the front door. He was already open, about to leave, and he looked and he said, I was molested for 3 years. And suddenly I realized, for 17 years, I never knew this. I was always giving him stupid advice. Advice based on somebody who really got their lives together. But his core was affected. There was a damage in such a deep place. He wasn't thinking straight. He didn't believe in himself. In his mind, he was that shmata. He was that doormat. But he never told it to me. How was I supposed to know? I didn't even think in such terms. And I have to say, honestly, it opened up a new world to me. Today, it's always my second question to the person. Not that they say yes, but sometimes they say yes. But it's my second question. My mind goes right there. I don't know if it's always appropriate. I don't speak to people as a professional therapist. It's a different type of conversation. It's more as a friend. But my mind always goes there. So the brothers say to themselves, we're guilty because our brother was pleading with us. V'lo shamanu, we did not listen to him. And my dearest friends, I think the time has come for many of us in positions of leadership, and every one of us is in a position of leadership. Every therapist, every parent, every teacher, every principal, every rabbi, every clergyman, every mother, every father, every older sibling, everyone is in a position of leadership to get up and say, Aval Hashemim anachnu. The buck stops here. We have to take accountability. For years, our little Josephs, our little boys, our little girls, or older boys and girls were pleading with us, sometimes with their mouth, sometimes with their eyes, sometimes with their silence. And so many of us must say, Lo shamanu. We didn't hear it. We were deaf. We were numb. We were clueless. We pushed it under the rug. We suppressed it. We repressed it consciously, unconsciously. We said it will become better. It's not a big deal. V'lo shamanu. And you know, there is even more fascinating than this is the response. After the brothers say this to each other, we're guilty. Their oldest brother, Reuven, turns to them. You know what he says to them in the next verse in Genesis? Vayan Reuven, Reuven responds to them and he says, Halo amarti lechem, I told you. Al techtu bayeled, don't sin against a child. And his blood is now being demanded from you. And the commentators struggle with this response. Imagine somebody comes to you and opens up their heart and says, I did terrible things. Should the response be, I told you, you didn't listen to me? Come on. The brothers open up to each other. They break down. They say, we did a horrible thing and we are now being accountable for it. So what does their older brother say? I told you. I told you, Al techtu bayeled. You see, I was always smarter. I'm the older brother. What's the point? What are you trying to tell them? Okay, you were right. We were wrong. Thank you. What should we do now? I told you not to sin against the child. Because indeed, Reuven was the one who said, don't kill him. He said, don't kill him. He's the one who said, throw him into the pit because he wanted to save him. It didn't work. One of the profoundest explanations that is so relevant to today's day is Reuven noticed a problem in their confession. They said, we're guilty because we didn't listen to the pleas of our brother. We're guilty. They focused on their guilt, on them being accused as spies, on their suffering. And he said, you still didn't get it. What I told you was, don't sin against a child. It's not about you being caught. It's about what happened to the child. Very often in life we make mistakes, and then, as we say in English, spaghetti hits the fan. And we have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences make us feel horrible, and they make us feel remorseful. But that is not what repentance is. Repentance is not remorse because the consequences. Repentance is remorse because what I did to the child. Don't think about the consequences. What is going to happen to my school? What's going to happen to my community? What are they going to say in the press? What are they going to say about me? Am I going to be fired? That's all secondary. Can I think about the suffering of the child? Think about the child. What has happened to him? What is happening to her? That's where real change happens. Can I open up my mind and my soul and become sensitive to the plight of youngsters whose days are no days and nights are not nights, who getting out of bed is sometimes the hardest thing for them, who every day they ask themselves, why am I alive? Why didn't I die? Who look at websites for how to take their life or how to find the next drug to numb their pain and sometimes overdose, who wonder if they have a future. Just this morning, on the way here in the car, I got a call from a young girl who suffered terrible abuse in her home and tried to commit suicide. She wants to live, but sometimes the pain was so deep. She told me she tried to take her life, even though she wants to live. She's a happy person, essentially. Do I realize what happened to this child? When I look at it that way, I think differently. I respond differently. And here we come practically to our task here today. When it comes as therapists, and therefore as influencers, as people who deal directly with those who have suffered and are suffering, and their families. I want to address, for the next few moments, our practical duties and responsibilities and calling, the way I see it, from a Jewish perspective, from an ethical perspective. So many victims have shared with me that akin to the pain of the abuse itself was the pain, sometimes even more acute, of how they were accepted or rejected by their closest people. I've seen a study, interestingly, some of you probably know about this far better. I just was reading in the New York Times about a study of rats who were intentionally, some of the babies, separated from their mothers, and as a result experienced panic, hysteria, and dysfunction in terms of the behavior of rats. But then they watched what happens when there is reunification. And they came across a striking fact. In some cases, the mother rats and the other family members welcomed the abused rat and did not make much of the fact that this rat was treated differently. They welcomed it with the same warmth and same passion and same love, and within a few days the symptoms of dysfunction were gone. Where in other situations, the unification was so problematic because this rat was mistreated and treated differently, and it was much harder for the rat to recover. And I was looking at this and asked myself, isn't this a profound lesson? As the child or teenager or adult or any person at any age reveals what happened, what type of acceptance is there? A girl emailed me the other day how when she came home and told her mother and father that she was abused by an uncle, their sole response was, make sure not to tell anybody because it could ruin a good shidduch for you. Anybody knows what a shidduch is? Shidduch means a good match. Nobody's going to want to marry you. You're damaged goods. I am positive the father and mother thought they were doing exactly the right thing for the future of their child. Little do they know that created such trauma in the soul of that poor girl. She's writing to me, a stranger who she does not know, pouring out her heart, how she has nobody in the world. She came to her parents, and all they can do is tell her, shh, meaning, either we don't believe you or it's not serious, completely delegitimizing her experience and her emotions, completely not giving her the dignity and the value of saying something traumatic happened, something serious happened. All we're talking now about is my match with a boy that I'm going to marry in a few years, based on repression, based on cover-ups. This creates such dysfunction, such neurosis, such suffering, such pain, such agony. But what happens if these parents can have support, can have education? What happens if there could be open communication between a therapist and fathers and mothers and siblings, explaining to them what their role is, explaining their duty with compassion but firmness, with sensitivity but clarity, with empathy but decisiveness, explaining to them both the system of the law, the system of reporting, the cycle of things, what happens, the events. There should be able to be a partnership, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of community. The greatest tragedy of abuse is that these kids are all alone in the world. They feel they have no support, and often they become isolated from family who doesn't understand them, who can't be there for them. They either freak out and say, you're destroying the family. A few days ago, I get a call. Somebody was abused by a brother. A sister was badly abused by a brother. And it took her 15 years to speak about it, because her marriage was being destroyed. She couldn't be with her husband normally. Her husband was a replica of her brother in her imagination, and every time they were in the bedroom, you'll forgive me, she had a hysterical panic attack. It was a disaster, and he, this poor guy whom I know, didn't know what to do. And finally, she spilled the beans with a therapist, and that brother was making a wedding, and she couldn't come. She couldn't come because she never faced it. And her whole family ganged up at her, and they said, "You are destroying our family single-handedly." And the sadness of it, the sheer tragedy of it, is so overwhelming. Which is why part of our event today here, I think, is so important to emphasize the need to communicate constantly with family, to clarify, to explain, to educate, to try to help them understand what this child, what their sibling went through, what their grandchild went through, what their nephew or niece went through, what their child went through. Especially if it came from within the family, which makes it even more disastrous because it's now family against family. And that constant guidance and reassurance that we are not here to destroy people's lives and to besmirch families and to destroy families. We are here to help truth emerge. What we want is people to be safe, people to be able to live functional lives, people to be able to live secure lives, people to be able to heal, people to be able to feel that there is justice, that there is truth, that crimes of abuse will not be manipulated and suddenly the abused victim is the one who's guilty and the perpetrator becomes the great saint and the great tzaddik because they walk around in wonderful holy garments smiling all over the place. Nebuch, this Meshugana who decided that 10 years ago I was a criminal. And she or he become the perpetrators. A double and a triple abuse. All these things we have to take accountability for because we can change things. We can create, as I said, a much brighter tomorrow. So when you meet those people, when you meet those individuals, see it as part of your role. I don't know how it works professionally. I'm not a professional in this issue, so I can't give any advice this way or that way. But I think understanding the crisis, the uncertainty that a family goes through, especially in tight-knit communities. Some of you deal with very tight-knit communities. Some people who live very isolated lives. They live insulated lives, not isolated, insulated lives. In their own cocoon, their own language, their own lexicon, their own dictionary. They have their own way of thinking about things. And this is where our role as leaders, your role as therapists, is to really see it as an all-inclusive, I don't want to call it project, but as an all-inclusive strategy. To be able to meet them, to be able to reassure them, to be able to help them feel that there's a support in you. They can call you, they can email you, they can ask you their questions, they can cry in front of you, even though the person you're primarily responsible to is the person, is the victim. To report what you have to report, to share the information you have to share in a responsible way. Understanding the consequences, but sharing it with the family, bringing them into the picture, and giving them a support that they often don't have, especially sometimes other community members may put pressure on them to back off, to dismiss you. You become the crazy person. To dismiss authorities, to put it back under the rug, to shh. There's sometimes enormous pressure. Grandparents and brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law and other community members who wants a ruckus, who wants all this attention. And they're under tremendous pressure, they're under enormous pressure. And they sometimes think they're doing the right thing, and now you become the enemy. And this is where we have to sit with them and appeal to their own sense of truth, to their own sense of conscience, and most importantly, to understand the consequences for the children. Because somebody who was abused, it's not going to go away by going shh and saying we don't want to hear about this. It's not going away. And if families are burying children every year because of their suicides or because of their overdosing, it's not for no reason. It's because of so many of these kids had to suffer in silence and desperation. They had to numb their pain. And one number is not enough tomorrow. Tomorrow I need a bigger number and a stronger number. And the next week I need a stronger number until I become completely numb and lifeless, physically or emotionally or psychologically or spiritually. Mothers, deep down, are the great protectors of their children. Mothers like lionesses. Mothers know it. You look a mother in the eyes and say, you carried this child for 9 months. You sacrificed yourself for this child. You nursed this child for years and years. You were up 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning with blood, sweat, and tears for this child. Don't allow political correctness. Don't allow social conformity. Don't allow social anxiety. Don't allow rumors and hearsay to now make your greatest mistake as a mother or as a father. And that is not protect this child now. Not fight for their rights. Not be there for them, despite the pressure you're getting by other people who may again not be malicious, but are ill-advised and often don't understand the consequences of this person. You stand behind them. You be there for them, because the objective here is not revenge, not anger, and not blood. The objective here is safety, protection, healing, and being there for people who were murdered once, not allowing them to be murdered twice, 3 times, or 4 times. My dearest friends, excuse me. I come now to one more final point. And then I want to open the floor for some questions or dialogue, or as good Jews, objections, or as better Jews, alternate speeches. Just from my experience with audiences. And go back again to that story and its ending. The brothers say we're guilty because we didn't listen to our brother crying when we abused him. Reuven says, I told you, don't sin against a child. Joseph hears their remorse. He weeps. Ultimately, a year later, he reveals his identity to his brothers. The family is reunited. And in shocking words, he tells them, don't get depressed because you did not sell me. God sent me. You tried to harm me. You tried to abuse me. But God sent me to Egypt because as a result of me becoming prime minister, I saved this whole country from a famine and the entire Middle East, including our own family. As a result of you doing what you did, I could become the person I am today. And I think as therapists, maybe I'm going now out of protocol, I'm going into my world, but you asked me to speak, so that's what I do. I can't speak about you, I speak about my world. I want to now bring out this point. As therapists, you go through due process. You were trained for many years how to listen, how to communicate, what to listen for, what to communicate, how to appreciate, how to be sensitive, how to help a patient towards a brighter future, towards a brighter tomorrow. If I could sum up the Jewish perspective on this, after everything I said before about the damage, the severity, the murder, I think there's one more message we always have to have in the back or the front of our mind with our patients, with their family members, and with everybody involved. And that is, deep down, our great faith teaches us that nobody can destroy your soul. Your soul is a piece of the divine. It's a fragment of infinity. No abuser, no molester, as vicious and rude as they are, can ultimately really, really murder you to the point where there's no core left. Despite the darkness, despite the skeletons, despite the nightmares, despite the anxiety, despite the depression, despite the tremendous pain, I believe that deep down in your soul, you have the ability to overpower the abuse and the molestation, because your goodness is more powerful than any abuse. At the core of your soul, there is a wholesomeness, a confidence, a power, an invincibility that reflects its divine source that nobody can destroy. And I will be here with you to fight for your integrity, to fight for your future, to fight for your core. Yes, there are a lot of voices in you that want to destroy you, but they are not ultimately your voice. Your inner, deepest, quintessential voice is a voice full of possibility, full of promise. This was Joseph's power. He could look at his brothers and say, I knew pain, I knew suffering, I wept a lot, but at the end of the day, I will not forever be a victim. I will not view myself, I do not view myself as somebody who was sold. I view myself as somebody who was sent. The greatest gift I can give a survivor is empathy, support, unconditional love, an unconditional ear and heart, but together with that, powerful faith in their power, in their ability, in their potential, in their goodness, in their innermost core that nobody can take from them, that nobody can damage, even though that molester made them feel like damaged goods, like a loser, like a schmata, like a victim. You were not a ping pong ball that's just thrown around. And I think part of that, what can help that so much, is Joseph's words. I was ultimately sent. I am an ambassador. I am an ambassador of love, light, and hope, often sent to challenging and dark places to be able to bring light into those places. And if I could see my life in that way, I could learn how to maybe look back and reframe my experiences. You know, you have a picture and it's hanging in your dining room. It doesn't look good because it's not framed right. You have to reframe it. Joseph did not deny the abuse that his brothers did to him. What he did is he chose how to frame it. I could say, I was sold. I'm a victim. I was a 7-year-old unfortunate person with terrible mazel, and here I am with a miserable, miserable, miserable life. Why can't I just be like my sister? And there's a very deep need to empathize, to listen to that. But equally, I think, we have the duty and responsibility to say, can you find a place in yourself where you could look at yourself and say, no more. I'm suffering, but I'm not a victim. I was not sold. I was sent. God somehow evaluated my soul, knew exactly its strengths, and sent me into certain places, knowing that I will have the courage and the resolve to be able to bring light into those places, to transform darkness into light, to make my life deeper, more aware, more enlightened, more blessed. And this is another moment. I again go back to our basic textbook. Jacob is alone in Genesis, and a man wrestles with him and tries to abuse him until dawn break, which is when most abuse, or a lot of abuse, happens in the middle of the night. And he tries killing Jacob, but unsuccessfully. So what does he do? He does what every abuser does. He maims him. And Jacob's sciatica is now wounded. His sciatic nerve is damaged, and he can't walk straight. He's limping, not just physically, emotionally. What happens to an abused victim? They can't stand straight. Physically, they may stand erect, but emotionally, they are downtrodden. They're dejected. They can't walk straight. There's no pride. There's no dignity. I'm always doubting myself. That's what happened to Jacob that night. And finally, when dawn broke, when the cameras came, when morning came, and this mysterious abuser said, "Let me go," because Jacob was holding on to him. Jacob tells him the strangest response, "Lo yashalechacha ki im beirachtani." I will not let you go until you bless me. You bless me? Imagine you're in a dark alley and somebody attacks you. You call 911. You don't ask them for a bracha. You don't ask them for a blessing. What does it mean? I'm not going to send you away till I'm blessed. Friends, there's a very deep message here. It's the secret of resilience, the secret of Jewish history. Jacob said, it's not enough for me to get away from you. Because if it would have been just enough for me to get away with you, God would have never had me meet you in the first place. What I need to do is something much deeper. I will not leave you until I do not come out blessed from this encounter. I want to be able to look at my life and say, my experiences have allowed me to live a deeper, more powerful, more bright, more luminescent, more promising life. I'll be able to be an advocate for other people who were abused. I'll be able to become a leader. I'll be able to empathize with other people like nobody else. I'll be able to become a source of inspiration, a source of truth, a source of justice for this community. I will be able to become a voice. I will be able to become a leader. I will use my darkness as a springboard for a weirdness, for a new dawn, for a new light. I'm not only going to let you go, I have to come out of this experience more blessed, but never ever allow this to eclipse empathy. Empathy is always the key word. You have to feel that I'm here for you where you are today. But deep down, what I want to give my students, my disciples, my friends, people who come to me is, I want they should never lose their faith in themselves. They should never ever allow the abuser to ultimately define their life. They will define their lives. Their mission will define their lives. Their power will define their lives. Their neshama will define their lives. Their inner godliness will define their lives. Not the abuser. They will have to deal with darkness, but they will define the darkness. They will not allow the darkness to define them. As in many homes, the microwave oven is still very popular. It's getting less and less popular because all of the articles about radiation. But it's still popular because my grandmother, when I came to her house and she wanted I should eat a baked potato, it took an hour and 20 minutes to prepare the potato, and I had to sit and wait. And if I wanted it more well done, it was another 45 minutes for a stupid potato. Today with the microwave, you put the potato in, and if it's not ready in 3 minutes, or better 2 minutes, you sue the company, and you get a new one and an oven and a new kitchen with a granite counter. But as always, not many of us ask the question, how did the microwave come about? And just a little lovely story that I think is very relevant to our conversation. There was a fellow named Spencer, an orphan, taken in by his uncle and aunt, and then his uncle died at 7. He was left alone in the world, really a lone child, ultimately joined the U.S. military in the late 30s, had a good sensitivity to electronics as an electrician, started to work for the war effort, started to work for the army. And he was working with radar technology. And one day, Mr. Spencer, in the early 1940s, in the middle of the Second World War, came in to the office with a chocolate bar in his pocket. And the chocolate bar was there simply for a snack in the afternoon. You know, you come in with a little snack, and he had one of those chocolate bars in his pocket. And you'll forgive me, I just like telling the stories the way they happened. In the middle of the day, he was standing in his office, and suddenly he feels an oozing flow of liquid internally in his body, and he realized that his chocolate bar melted, but didn't only melt, had a full meltdown, and the impact was felt in many parts of his lovely body, including, of course, his legs, up and down. Now, what would most people do at such a moment? It has happened before in that office that chocolate bars melted. You basically utter a few words, which I will not repeat at the moment, and you go home and you shower, you change your clothes, and you either take the day off and you go sip an iced coffee, or you come back to the office with a new uniform, with a new set of pants, which is what most people in the past did. The uniqueness of Spencer was, before getting angry, upset, annoyed, frustrated, and running home and cursing the world and the army and America, he stopped to investigate. Why did my chocolate bar melt? And of course he discovered the impact of the waves, of the radar waves that melted his chocolate bar, and at that moment the microwave oven was invented in reality. Literally at that moment. The first one was huge. It was $7,000. It was 750 pounds. It was a crazy monster. It took him till the 1960s to create the nice compact microwave that we have today. You go into the store and for $45, you can have a wonderful microwave. But when I read this, the first time I thought to myself, everybody has a chocolate bar that melts at some point. We all have meltdowns in our lives. Some of them are as superficial as a chocolate bar melting, and some of them are deeper than chocolate bars melting. And they're very annoying. The choice that people have in life is not if there is going to be a meltdown of the chocolate bar or not, but what I do with it. Some people take the meltdown and get upset at the world, and others take the meltdown and invent microwave ovens. So my blessing, my prayer to all of us today here is that when you experience and you see the pain that you see, the trauma that you observe, the injustice that you observe, the cover-ups that you observe, they can cause meltdowns. They should cause meltdowns, but don't stop there. Let every meltdown become the genesis of discovery, the genesis of creating an oven, a space of warmth, of light, of passion, and awareness. May God bless you, and God bless your sacred work. Thank you very much.